I would like to thank Mehran and Zahra and the Center for International and Regional Studies, Georgetown Doha, for this opportunity to talk to you guys about something that I've been working on for the last several years and I'm very passionate about. So today, I don't have a lot of slides. I just have some of the things that I want to highlight. But the first thing I want to show you is just an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about brief history of migration in the Gulf, determinants, why do people come here, why did they come here, the type of migration, and migrants, who came, and is there anything special about them. The next section is going to be one of the main consequences of migration, which is remittance outflows. I'm going to talk about the size, an interesting story about their direction, and consequences, or potential consequences. And the last thing, I'm going to open up for challenges and opportunities that the region is actually facing, the Gulf, the GCC countries, mainly locally labor markets, and also regionally, and also globally. So economists always believe people move because the expected income at the destination is higher than the current income at the current place or country. Not just the expected income in the sense that the current expected income, but also the present value, the future expected income. And that's exactly really what happened in the GCC countries. People came here for two reasons. One, because they were needed, and two, because the expected income in the Gulf was higher than what they were making. But what made this? How did the GCC countries were able to make a difference, basically, in the wage gap, or increase, or have a wage gap? There are two types of factors. The first set of factors are factors related to the Gulf that made the GCC countries an attractive destination. These were basically, obviously, and everyone is going to expect them, these were discovery of large oil reserve and natural gas. So the hydrocarbon, if you want, richness of the region. Now, there is an interesting story here that the first oil field was found in Iran in 1909, and then after that moved to Bahrain, and then from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia in the 1930s, 1940s, and I moved to Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. I actually invite you to go read the story because initially, after finding oil in Iran and looking in the region, it took 3 years without finding any oil. And in fact, some of the geologists that were working during that time, they went against the company's orders. And the company was, I think, Standard Oil Company in California, which I think became Chevron, because they were called out. But they decided, they believed truly that there is oil. And once they struck oil in Saudi Arabia, that changed the whole region. In fact, the modern Saudi Arabia that we know of is because of that moment. So the GCC countries have a lot of oil. They have large reserves. This is historically in terms of since they were found, since they were production, in terms of natural reserves, in terms of production. The numbers change, but you hear almost 50% of the world's reserves are found in the Gulf. More or less, depending on the years and depending on how you actually count them. The same applies for production, for oil, for crude oil, and also natural gas. Now, that's one. So the GCC countries could afford, basically, foreigners. But the other thing is they needed them, too. Why did they need them? Because the population in the region was very small. I'll give you an example. In 1981, when the GCC Council was formed, the population was around 15 million in the whole Gulf. Now, that included a lot of foreigners, too. I don't know actually how many. But 15 million on a large piece of land, and that land is almost 30% of the United States. So 15 million and almost 30%, if you want, in the United States. So there was plenty of land and a very small population. Add to it very ambitious development projects, because you can actually fund those. You needed labor, and you needed labor fast. Now, you can also add another aspect, is that the population was small, but also inexperienced. Inexperienced because the countries here were not at the same level of industrialization relative to other neighboring Arab countries. You look at the mid-1900s, if you look at Lebanon versus the GCC countries, if you look at Egypt versus the GCC countries, you can easily see the difference. So they could afford them, they were small, inexperienced, and very young, too. Less than 2% of the population was above 65 years old, which is actually is this same story for the Middle East, for the GCC countries. We still have a very young population. So the ultimate goal was to develop and develop fast, and the best way to do so is to bring labor. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'll tell you where they brought the labor once actually we move forward with the presentation. So on one side, they could actually afford them, they needed them. So one side of the story was there. What about the other side of the story? Why would people come to the Gulf? So even if somebody wanted you, and even if somebody could afford you, if you were happy at home, it would be more difficult for you to leave. Well, let's look at the other side. The other side, I'm going to start with the non-GCC Arab countries, so the Middle East countries. If you look since World War II, up until before the Arab Spring, up until 2010, the Middle East has had 28 serious conflicts. When I say serious conflicts, it's large wars. I'm not talking about the other almost 100 small revolutions and fighting and conflict on the ground. So 28 serious wars with at least 1,000 deaths and several thousands injured. You're talking about the most volatile region in the world. Now, the geographical location of these conflicts was not random. In fact, in the GCC, only two, and they are almost actually one, which is the 1990-1991 First Gulf War. So the invasion of Kuwait, and then after that, the First Gulf War. You can actually have them one. And this is the only conflict that occurred in the GCC. Other than that, all the conflicts occurred in the neighboring regions. So you had one major role, one major factor for people to leave their country because it was actually very unstable. Another factor is because economic performance. So there were just no job opportunities. No job opportunities, high unemployment. Unemployment rate, if you can actually find the numbers in the Middle East, you will find them randomly and for different years. But in most cases, it was always above 10, and in fact, probably even more above 20%. The latest IMF report puts the youth unemployment in the Middle East around to around 22%. So you're a Syrian, you're Palestinian, you're Jordanian, you're Egyptian, you're Yemeni, you're Sudanese, and you're thinking, there's war, there's conflict, it's not, there's no jobs, and it's really a dead end. However, there's a potential opportunity in the Gulf. Now, if you look at other source of labor, which are non-Arab countries, so South Asian and Southeast Asian, you can also find that the economic performance was also not good, mainly because of actually large population. If you look at India, if you look at Pakistan, if you look at Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, you have large population. So when you look at standards of living, when you look at income per capita, one of the main measures that economists use, then you're going to find it's actually very low income per capita. So put these together. You had reasons to push you out of your country and the reasons to actually welcome you. Once you put them together, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a large, 1990s and 2000s, large flows of people to the Gulf. Now, I want to actually tell you something. The most recent independence is 1971, right? So this is the last formation of a GCC country. After that, there was the oil embargo. And during that time, people actually refer to it as the largest transfer of wealth in human history. So the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, at first, received the largest transfer of wealth in human history. In fact, it's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is in the 1970s. However, the GCC countries shared it with the world by how? By inviting foreigners from basically almost all countries. So that said, how can we actually see it on the ground? Well, if you look at 2010, you can see that the standards of living in Qatar is 23 times that of Sri Lanka. Again, I'm using the income per capita, which is a common measure for the standards of living. It's actually 35 times of Yemen, 50 times of Sudan, and 70 that of Bangladesh. Now, this is in general terms. What about on a personal level? If you were an Egyptian farmer in the 70s and you came to Saudi Arabia, you made 30 times more your salary. In the 80s, if you were a school teacher in Egypt, you made 20 times your salary. In the 90s, if you're a Jordanian engineer, you tripled your income by moving to Kuwait. So that I'm saying the wage gap is really, really high. In fact, I told you that the Middle East is the region that has the largest number of conflict. It's actually the region that has the largest variation of standards of living. The largest region that has the largest variation. If you put Yemen, if you put Sudan, if you put Syria, Iraq on one side, and if you put the GCC countries on the other side, you will see this, and actually you see the numbers right there. So what I'm trying to say is that the determinants to come to the Gulf mainly came from both sides, and mainly focus on large wage gap that even touched personal individuals, and people actually felt it by moving to the Gulf. And it was very safe, very stable. Now, if you actually divide the Middle East, you're going to divide them by all exporters, all importers. You can also divide them by labor importers and labor exporters. It's actually almost the same classifications. And you can even divide them by safe versus, stable versus unstable, with the exception of Iraq. Iraq is the only one that has actually had large, hydrocarbon reserves, but also had conflicts. Now, interestingly, the reasons existed for everybody to come, whether from Arab neighboring countries or whether from South Asian, a little bit further down. Now, we talked about the determinants. Now we're going to talk about the type of migration. So we know why people came to the Gulf, but I want to know what kind of migration we're talking about. Do people come here for long term? I mean, is this something that you can actually bring your family, and is something that you can actually, settle down? If you look at traditional destination for migration, whether North America or whether Europe, then you have long-term plans. You come in, let's say you go to school, you can actually maybe find a job, get your family, and slowly get some sort of separation from your home country. This, to a certain extent, is not really true in the GCC countries. It's a temporary migration phenomenon. So all the studies talk about migration. We use the same term, but it may not be very accurate. In fact, the GCC countries, in many official meetings, they struggle in terms of how do they want to call them. Are they actual migrants? Are they expatriates? Are they foreign workers? Are they contract workers? Who are they? And it's actually kind of a sensitive topic, because when you say migration, you say somebody who could actually come and get the local citizenship and stay. So what the type of migration basically is divided into, is seen in the following. If you come here, you cannot get a citizenship. There's no path for citizenship. Unless there's an extreme case. For example, Rafiq al-Hariri, who was the prime minister of Lebanon, became a Saudi citizen. But he was very close to the king. And actually, he had major contribution in Saudi Arabia. But beyond that, you should forget it, basically. Number two, you cannot own property. Now, in the last few years, and I'm going to say Dubai because I'm aware of what's going on, they're trying to push that forward. They're trying to actually find a way for ownership of real estate. But there is a big question mark. The latest US Department report says, at the end of the day, you still, there are plenty of things, but you just don't own it. You may own what's above the land, but not the land. So, no citizenship and no real estate ownership. Number 3, if you are unskilled, and I'm going to say unskilled, you can measure it different ways, but in this way is that you make less than a certain amount of money a month, you cannot bring your family members, your immediate family members. In the UAE, the latest figure is $2,700 a month. If you make less than that, you're going to be by yourself. If you make above that, you can actually sponsor your family. So, no citizenship, no ownership of real estate. You're most likely going to be by yourself. I'm going to talk about skilled and unskilled numbers in a second. The fourth one is they are really tough. This country is very tough on expatriates. The laws are very strict and very tough. I'll give you a simple example. Kuwait recently has been deporting foreigners and expatriates based on traffic violations. So traffic violations could be, you ran a red light. Okay, that's serious. But could be also carpooling. So, come in, let's go. For many expatriates, this is not really a serious crime, but it could actually lead to your deportation and loss of that income and job. And also, in most cases, banned for life. Now, all of these 4 are all negative in the sense that if you want to come to the Gulf, you're like, why should I come? And this is 1, 2, 3, it's very dangerous. People know these even before they come. In fact, many people have friends here, many foreign potential expatriates. You hear, you read. These days, information transfer is very large, but you still decide to come. And the reason you start is this come, again, wage gap and stability, but also because there is a large, what I'm going to call it, an infinite supply of labor. Maybe not at every skill level, but definitely at an unskilled level. In fact, what I'm trying to say is that if you look at the GCC, they can recruit from India, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, from Pakistan, or from the Arab countries. And because of the economic performance and instability, especially recently in the Arab countries, then the number of people willing to come is very large, almost unlimited. If you add the population across all these countries, you have more than half the population of the world. So the GCC countries actually see them as perfect substitutes too. You made a mistake, we deport you, we can bring 10 others exactly who are willing to come. Now, that said, so we talked about determinants, and we talked about the type. We're going to talk about the migrants. So who actually come here? To be honest, we know, but not to a certain extent that we would like to know. Those who come here are young, usually, and are usually male, specifically unskilled labor, specifically construction workers. They're usually actually single and not very educated. And the reason is, this is actually being diluted by the availability and the large number of unskilled workers. If you remove them, then you might see more educated, a larger share of people with college degrees. But the majority have actually a high school degree. Now, in terms of gender ratio, because of the unskilled workers, the construction workers, in Qatar, if you are between 25 and 54, the male to female ratio is 5:1. So I always tell my friends, if you're a single male, you don't want to go to Doha. You're not going to find a wife, that's for sure. Now, that number is exactly 3:1 in the UAE. In Lebanon, it's exactly the opposite. It's 5 women to 1 man for another social issue. Now, that said, I'm talking about temporary nature of migrants, and I'm telling you basically that it's mainly male. You have to know that temporary doesn't mean that you cannot stay here for a long time. In fact, there are several, several cases and examples of people who've been here for decades. You have a sponsor, the sponsor, renews your visa, and you continue to stay. You have kids, and your kids actually are here. But at the same time, you know that eventually this is not a retirement place. I mean, people don't come here for retirement. Okay, they come here for work. Now, that said, there's an also interesting story in terms of the nationality makeup of the countries here, the expatriates, I'm sorry, in the GCC countries. So, after the independence in 1971, large production and export of oil, large foreign currency reserves coming into the Gulf, oil embargo, largest transfer of wealth. Who came first? It was the non-GCC Arabs who came first in the 70s and the 80s. The reason is just because they speak the language. In most cases, they share the religion and culture, and also they are close, proximity. So mainly, actually, Arabs came to the GCC. But that changed and started to change in the mid-80s slowly. So what did the GCC countries, I think, realize, and I'm going to tell you why, that the Arab workers are actually annoying. They're troubles. I mean, they're bringing trouble. I'll tell you why in a second. So starting in the mid-80s, they started slowly to not renew visas for Arabs and slowly replace them with South Asian and Southeast Asian workers. Now, when that started in the 80s, the sudden shock event of the 1990-1991 war, which is the Gulf War, it actually made the process much faster. In fact, that was really a structural break in the nationality or in the source of workers. Before that, majority were Arabs. After that, majority are Asians. For many reasons, mainly related to geopolitics. So during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Palestinian government, the Yemeni government, for example, stood with the Saddam regime. Well, then Saudi Arabia deported what people estimate between 600 and 700,000 Yemenis from Saudi Arabia, 300,000 Palestinians from Kuwait, and in other places. These were the documented ones. And in fact, the literature on migration in the Gulf is clear about that. This is not something I have done. What I added to it, I'll show you in a second, something that you can actually see on paper, that Remittances basically showed it to us. All right, so we talked about determinants, we talked about type, we talked about migrants. We're going to talk about now remittances. But let me show you this number first. The estimates put the non-GCC Arabs in the 70s to be around 70% of the labor force, and the Asians less than 20%. That's exactly almost the opposite in 2005. That's the latest number I could get. Why did this happen? Because the GCC countries saw the Arab workers with great suspicion. They were suspicious of them. They were suspicious of them because they brought domestic ideologies from home that were not very welcome in the Gulf. They brought also other potential ideas. I'm going to link that to Egypt in a second. Number two, they also found, the GCC found out that the Asian workers were superior. They were economically superior. Why? Because they could pay them less. The Asian workers would accept worse working conditions, also borderline abuse of the work environment or workforce. And also, they found out too that Arab workers, want to come and stay and want to bring family. And also, Arab women usually don't come alone, so they want to bring the whole family. That's an issue. You don't want to do that. While South Asian workers would come alone. In fact, even women, for example, women from Bangladesh, women from Sri Lanka would come alone. So they preferred that. This is that invasion of Kuwait was a very clear, and I'll show you in a second, a division in terms of the source of labor. And actually, I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to actually throw this at you. I think the same thing is happening now with what's going on outside the GCC. I'll give you a very simple example. If you want to hire somebody, a foreigner, you want to bring him here, anywhere in the Gulf. Let's say he's from Egypt. Then is he Muslim Brotherhood? Is he non-Muslim Brotherhood? There's an issue here. So let's bring an Indian guy. Better. It's actually less headache. So maybe in 5 years, we are going to actually see some of the consequences of that, like I'm going to show you in a second. All right, so let's talk about remittance from the Gulf. Now, a remittance are the money sent by migrants back home. And remittances has been growing in the last several decades. People have actually worked on them, researchers, policymakers, academicians, because they are large. The number of amount of remittance have increased tremendously. They're above $500 billion now, the latest estimate by the World Bank, and they're much less volatile, much more stable than foreign direct investment and foreign aid. In fact, during the last recession, remittances in many countries declined by 5%, but never, and then after that increased. In fact, the remittances from the GCC did not show any sign of slowing down. There are many ideas behind why that happened. But now let me ask you this. If you are living in a country that you cannot own land, you cannot get a citizenship, you cannot bring your family, at any time you have to leave and it's temporary, what would you do? You send money back home as much as you can. Because eventually you're going to go back. So if you are in Europe or if you are in North America, there is a potential of you staying, and there is a potential of bringing your family. So eventually that sending money back home might die down, but not here. In fact, you have all the reasons for you to send money, and send money as much as you can. And some of the research we've seen, and we need much more evidence, people send more than 12 times a year. So in other sense, they send more than once a month. So it's a very dynamic remittance market. And UAE Exchange, for example, it's a big company here, accounts for almost 5% of remittances in the world, mainly from the region. So how big are remittances? This shows you the share of remittances from the Gulf to the total remittances in the world. I wanted to show this first because it actually gives you an idea that, okay, so the remittance data in the 70s is a little bit questionable, but once you look, you have a stable between 25% and 15% of any $1 basically remittances in the world comes from the Gulf. If you want to think about it, it's basically 1/4, 1/5 of remittances in the world come from the GCC. And there was some slowing down here, but then actually it went up. Again, why do people remit? We told you because you cannot really stay. So you want to build a way for you to go back, build a house or get yourself ready. But also because there is a large share of migrants as a percentage of the population in the Gulf. This shows you the mean percentage of the GCC population as foreigners. It increased, in fact, reached above 50% for several years. And now it went down. We have to actually add a few more years. It's hovering around 50%. Now, this is from the population. If you take the labor force, which means only those who are working, it's actually much higher than that. UAE and Qatar are notorious for having above 90% of the labor force as foreigners. In fact, the UAE's estimation for the population is 8 million currently in the UAE, and less than 1 million are Emiratis. So around 900,000. They push it to 1 million, just, 1 million looks better than less than 1 million. Now, that said, if you look at these numbers, you're going to tell me, well, how important is the Gulf in terms of a migration debate? Well, the GCC countries are the third labor importing region in the world after North America and Europe. And North America and Europe historically, basically, were destination for people leaving. So the GCC countries is very, very important in that sense. Okay, so now we know that they send money. How much money? Well, in 2011, the official, so this is what we know, is $71 billion from the GCC countries, the largest from any region in the world. In fact, the largest remitter is the United States, single country, with around $50 billion. If you put the GCC together, it's more than that. Saudi Arabia, historically, in the last 5 years, ranks second after the US, with almost $30 billion money sent from the GCC outside. I mean, if you look at this number and you look at the national production of countries close to the GDP, this is above. It's more than, it's the GDP of Lebanon every year. Now, this is also official, meaning if I put money in my pocket and I go to Jordan and give it to my mom, we don't know how much it is. The estimate is that probably it's twice that 70. So it's definitely more than $100 billion. Now, this obviously, raises the question. So, shall we worry about this? I mean, from a GCC perspective, I'm a government. Shall I worry about having money basically leaking every year, significant amount? This is as you're trying to, fill a bathtub, and there's a big hole, and you put more money in, and then you put more money in, put more water, and the water is actually flowing. So there's a big question. I'm going to talk about it when I talk about consequences in a second. The main point I want to show you is this. So the literature was very clear about the nationality makeup of the region, about the structural break in terms of the importing of labor. But what I added is this. So one day I was playing around with data, and I looked at, so the blue is the amount of remittances from the Gulf, from the 6 countries, and the red is the amount of remittances coming to the Middle East without the 6 countries. I even excluded also, Turkey, but Iran is there. So what do you see? If you look at it, you see that actually outflows from the Gulf and inflows to the Middle East match each other up until mid to late 80s. Then the blue one, which is the money from the Gulf, actually stays up. It's actually going. But the other one goes down. Or at least it doesn't keep up with it. And that's why you see this big, hole. Now, let's talk about this before I actually move to the other side. So what does this mean? It means the money that was being sent out from the GCC countries was going back to the Middle East, up until late 80s, early 1990s, up until there was the Gulf War. Now the money was being sent out from the GCC still, but where is it going now? It's going to South Asian countries. And you can see it actually in that graph. So the idea here is actually interesting on many levels. The first one, it shows that the GCC countries' labor policies have tremendous impact on the flow of remittances, the direction of the money. But also, if you are a believer of the development impact of remittances, and the literature is very big on this, and the debate is actually even bigger, then Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen missed out on a lot of money and missed out on potential investments and potential consumption and potential plans that could have been done with this amount of money. And who were the benefits? South Asia. there's we don't. The question, stops here. We don't have evidence beyond that. But if the direction of money is different, then you can only wonder about the constant. I'm going to actually throw at you one crazy theory in a second that I'm trying to work on it. I tested this econometrically, and there is actually a structural break, which means the behavior of the time series of the money changes in 1990, which is exactly matches the first Gulf War. Now, if you look again, you're going to see that the remittance to the Middle East picked up, got close to the outflows of the GCC, and then again it seems that there's a wide diversion. I don't know. This is still work in progress. What's going on? We need actually more time series for that. But let me actually throw at you that crazy theory. When I was teaching my Middle East class in fall 2010, it was exactly October 2010, I told my students that, hey, there's 28 conflicts that occurred in the Middle East. And that, if you look at the, since World War II, if you look at the time frame, is 60 years, it's almost, you're going to expect a serious war or a conflict every 3 years. And I said the last one was 2008, the Gaza war. I said, based on data, we should have one. Well, in December 10, Mohammed Bouazizi basically, and the Tunisian revolution started. And then after that, you guys know what happened. Unfortunately, I was right, and it was beyond any imagination. So why am I telling you this story? Because the Middle East has the youngest population in the world. In fact, if you look at Syria, if you look at Iran, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Iraq, the median age is between 20 and 25. So 50% of the population is under 20. The median age of Japan and the median age of Germany, 44. There's a big difference. Now, these guys are young. These guys are educated. The education improvements in the Middle East have been very, very large. So what happened? They were able to come to the Gulf for jobs, but not anymore, because they were replaced by South Asian workers. So you're educated, young, frustrated. Mohammed Bouazizi from Tunisia could have been in the Gulf. Now, Tunisians went to France. That was the main destination. But because France and Europe was actually suffering from economic crisis, there were no opportunities for them and no opportunities in the Gulf. So my crazy theory is that labor policies in the Gulf and that change in nationalities has partial, or maybe partially, is behind some of what we had in terms of the Arab Spring. So I'm going to finish with just a few ideas about the challenges. So we talked about remittances and we talked about brief history. What are the challenges that we have? In terms of locally, in terms of the GCC, we have labor market challenges. The GCC countries were able to create in the last 10 years 7 million jobs. That's almost 1 million jobs a year. However, it's not the job creation that mattered, it's the type of job for the locals. I'm talking about the local workforce, the Emiratis and the Qataris. Because of this, you can see locally that the unemployment rate among the local Emiratis is 14%, among the female Emiratis is 28%, among the Saudis is 12%, among the Bahrainis and the Omanis is above 15%. So one important challenge is the type of job you create and how you bring in the local to actually for the job. Another challenge is the competition that I'm trying to stand on the side of the locals, the competition that they face with hundreds and thousands and millions of foreigners who are more experienced actually and who are cheaper. In fact, Emiratis get paid 30% more for the same qualifications than locals. Now, regionally, so just the last minute, so regionally, what's going on in Egypt, Syria, and other countries is affecting potentially labor policies in the future in the Gulf, just like we saw in 1990. And globally, shale gas and shale oil are becoming, because of technology, economically viable. And because you just go to Texas and you will see. And because of that, countries in the Gulf have to think about what will happen to the price of oil, and if at some point they would be able to balance their budget. At the end of the day, the main idea is to educate the young and allow them a competitive, or give them a competitive labor market. Thank you very much.